I'd like to speak to you sermon-wise this morning about something that is possibly going to be difficult for some of you to hear about or talk about. I want to talk to you about being disappointed with God. Is anybody ever disappointed with God? Honest, engine? You go to the doctor and you find out something about yourself or about your loved one that you don't want to hear? Yeah. I'm going to guess that many of you were taught that to admit disappointment with God is a sign of a lack of faith. And others of you may not think it's so much a lack of faith, but it still feels a little bit off. It feels maybe a little bit unseemly. And I also have no doubt that many of you probably heard in your lives, maybe even from somebody standing up here like me this morning, that the opposite of faith is doubt. And that makes it difficult to talk about our disappointments with God, because being disappointed with God is in some ways also doubting. So I want to let you know that I disagree with that statement as strongly as I possibly can. I actually believe that doubt is a huge part of faith. And I also believe with every fiber of my being that doubt is not the opposite of faith. The opposite of faith is fear. And this makes it important to me that we feel free to give voice to our disappointment with God, and that we do so boldly and without fear, or faithfully, in other words. Now, to prove my point, I could give you any number of psalms where the psalmists name their complaints and their grievances and their disappointments and their doubts. And as you read these various psalms of lament, you come to realize that naming our disappointments and our doubts is an integral part of the life of faith and part of the necessary process of having that faith renewed. Or I could simply point to the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew when they're talking about the death of Jesus, talking about the cross, where Jesus himself, borrowing words from those very same Psalms, borrowing words from Psalm 22, says what? My Lord, why have you forsaken me? If it's okay for Jesus to express a disappointment with God, I think it's okay with us. And I also think there's no better passage to explore the idea of disappointment with God than this confession and rebuke of Peter that we get in Mark this morning. And I think both sides matter very much, the confession and the rebuke. Because if there is one emotion that we can imagine Peter feeling after that rebuke, it's disappointment. I'm sure that there was probably some anger there, maybe some embarrassment. But foremost among the emotions that I think he was feeling at that time was disappointment. Disappointment because he's just named. In fact, he might have just figured out, he might have had some blinding flash of insight that when Jesus asked this question, "Who do you say that I am?" he realized, this is the Messiah. You are the Messiah, the Holy One of Israel, the living and breathing hope of my people. Which is why Peter reacts so strongly to Jesus' prediction of his fate. He simply can't imagine that the Messiah that he's been waiting for, the Messiah that he's heard about his entire life, is going to suffer, let alone the fact that he's going to be killed. And his shock is so great that I bet he didn't even hear that whole part about and be raised to life on the third day. All he hears is that awful, unthinkable word. The hope of Israel will be killed. And so he protests and is rebuked. I bet a lot of you feel the way that Peter felt after he was rebuked when you voice your disappointments with God. You probably feel that you are wrong to doubt God. Well, I would argue that there's nothing wrong with Peter in this particular instance, and there's nothing wrong with you when you doubt God. Peter may have been mistaken about how events were going to play out, and Peter surely has more to learn about the God that he follows and worships. But he isn't wrong in assuming that the Son of God should not suffer. Everything he has been taught and everything he knows about God screams in the very core of his being that this just can't be. And would any of us actually have been any different? Would our reaction be any different if we were hearing that for the first time? Who could have imagined that the God of heaven and earth would redeem the world by dying a criminal's death? Who among us could have predicted that God's strength would be shown most fully in his weakness? Who among us could have guessed that God's judgment would be rendered so fully and completely in undeserved and unexpected mercy? The whole thing is kind of unthinkable. We have the benefit of 2,000 years to look back on, to try to understand it a little bit, and let's be honest, we still struggle with it at times. It was all new for Peter. So we're not wrong to wonder where God is when we learn that our child has autism, or that our beloved partner's sickness is terminal, or when our relationship falls apart, or when our job, and with it so much of our identity, is eliminated, or when any number of other disappointments and disasters fall upon us. Because everything that we know, everything that we have been taught tells us that these are not the things that God wants or desires or wills for us. So we're not wrong to be disappointed with God. But just like St. Peter, we have more to learn. Because God always and only shows up in the broken places of our lives and our world. Like Peter, we're disappointed because we don't get the God we expect, the God that we've been taught to worship, the God we want. But also, like Peter, in Jesus and in the cross and resurrection, we discover not the God that we want, but the God that we so desperately need. The God who sheds his glory to join us in our shame. The God who leaves heaven to join our hell on earth. The God who abandons his strength, at least strength as we would imagine it, so that he can join us, so that he can embrace us, hold on to us, and love and redeem us in our weakness. Family, God comes to those of us who are broken in body and mind and spirit, and he comes to be one with us and for us. And that kind of God expects our disappointments, and he understands them. And he will come, if we will be honest about those doubts and disappointments, he will come and meet us in them to teach us again that it is in our brokenness that we sense and meet and are fully enveloped in God's amazing love. I think this is what Jesus meant by saying that those who want to save their lives, along with their expectations of what God should be like, will lose it. And those who are able to shed those expectations and the lives they've built around themselves will find abundant life. And this is very important. It matters tremendously because when we're disappointed with God, we tend to feel cut off, not just from God, but also from each other, from our community of faith, because we're not sure that our church family is ready to handle such strong emotions. But I'm telling you right now that it is precisely when we are the most disappointed and discouraged that we most need one another. That's why it's so important to talk about our disappointments, so that we can begin to imagine that church isn't just a place you go when everything is going well, but it's the place you run to when life is falling apart. So family, I'm asking you this morning to summon your courage and name your disappointments with God. Whether you do it aloud or in writing or in silent prayer. And do it without feeling ashamed or embarrassed. And know that God can handle your disappointments. And more importantly, that He has promised to meet you in those disappointments and to stay with you until you come out of the other side of them into peace and comfort. And because I understand full well how hard it can be to name and experience your pain, sorrow, and disappointment, as you're doing that, I want you to know that I love you, that I will be praying for you, that I will be supporting you and giving thanks for you in my prayers. Amen.